Here's someone who is standing up for the planet, standing up for her community, who's protecting the environment, who's protecting future generations. In any sane system, she would be held up as a hero, as an absolute example of
Hmm.
the best of humanity. Instead, she is denigrated. She is, threatened. And
Yeah.
so this is the system that we live in, but it's completely upside down.
Welcome to the Save Our Sperrins campaign, Voices from the Frontline. I'm Marella Fyffe, your host and a member of the Save Our Sperrins team. At the heart of this struggle are the voices of local people, farmers, families and young campaigners whose homes, work and families are rooted in this place. Their voices are joined by supporters from across the world, standing in solidarity, from professors to artists, from those offering vast expertise to those whose presence alone is an act of support. All have stood with us. In this series, we share stories of resistance, resilience, and hopes from those determined to protect these mountains, their land, their rivers, the very air they breathe, and their community. Let's get started. Today, I'm joined by Chris O'Connell, Senior Policy Advisor at Trócaire. Trócaire is an overseas development agency of the Catholic Church in Ireland. For over 50 years, it's worked with communities across the global south, tackling poverty, standing up for human rights, and challenging the systems that drive inequality and climate breakdown. Chris's work focuses on business and human rights, supporting efforts to ensure that companies act responsibly and are held accountable for their impact on people and the planet. I wanted to have him on the podcast because this conversation is relevant for communities like ours in the Sperrins. It's also important for businesses who might be listening, including those involved in large-scale extractive projects. It's a chance to explore how human rights principles can guide a more respectful and responsible way of doing business. Chris, thank you for joining me. And could you start by telling us a bit about your own background, where you are today, for instance, and how you came to work at Trócaire? What drew you into this area of business and human rights?
Okay, great. Thanks very much, Marella. It's great to be here. I suppose where I am right now is in a little village called Blackrock in County Louth, up near the border with between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland, and just outside of Dundalk, so close to the Cooley Mountains and the Mourne Mountains and the sea. So yeah, nice place to be. I grew up in a different place called Blackrock in Cork, actually,
Right.
and down near Páirc Uí Chaoimh, and I mean, in my background, I suppose, going back a ways, because I'm getting on now, is as a lawyer. I qualified as a lawyer, and I worked as a solicitor for a few years. But it wasn't particularly the sort of work I was doing wasn't particularly interesting to me, and so I left Ireland to travel. I lived in New Zealand for a while, but it was really, I suppose, when I went to live in Latin America and in particular in Ecuador, that was a kind of changing point of my life. I would say there's a real, like a watershed moment for me. And it wasn't even that I was there necessarily working on human rights or environmental issues. I was there initially teaching English and later working with international students. But uh, a lot of the context, I think, because I also didn't speak Spanish when I went, but I learned as I was there. And more the context that I was there in really came, it just fascinated me. There was widespread indigenous protest by the indigenous movement at the time. You'd often find streets, roads shut down or big blockades. And then, one of the presidents of the time was ousted by massive protests, a guy called Lucio Gutierrez while I was there. And later on, I lived through an attempted coup d'etat against another president, Rafael Correa. And then there was a really kind of internationally really interesting initiative that the Korea government was pushing, even though it really came from grassroots, kind of environmental social movements called the Yasuni ITT initiative, which was all about leaving the oil under the ground, something that now looks ahead of its time and incredibly important, but then was not really given a lot of consideration. And so I guess all of those things, when I came back to Ireland, made me want to know more and to get more involved. And so I sort of I both studied and started working in kind of activist uh, circles. So I became heavily involved in the Latin American Solidarity Center, or LASC, in Dublin, and I also started a PhD where I was studying the impacts of social movements on, particularly on environmental and development policies in the Andean region in Ecuador, Peru, and Bolivia. So I studied, huge socio-environmental issues like the Conga mine, which was going to be the biggest gold mine in the world at one stage in northern Peru. And at the same time, then through LASK, I got to meet amazing Latin American activists who came to Ireland. I'm thinking in particular of a year when I was coordinating LASK, and we had Gustavo Castro, the Mexican environmentalist who was alongside Berta Cáceres in
Mm-hmm.
Honduras when she was killed, and he was shot in the head, but he survived.
Mm-hmm.
And a more gentle and inspirational man you could meet, and Karina Flores, who also came that year, and I think went up to a conference in the Sperrins. She was from Honduras,
Mm-hmm.
and talked about experiences of Honduran activism against gold mining there. So I think all of those things sort of coalesced to bring me where I am today, and working in this area of business and human rights in Trócaire, and just increasingly convinced that at the heart, at the root of so many of our shared problems on the planet is this sort of out of control power of corporations and private interests that just seem to dictate to all other interests in the world how things should be run. And as we know, how things are being run is destroying the planet.
Yeah. Um, just to take you back there for a minute, was it difficult for you to shift from sort of mainstream, yeah, get a job, get a good job, work 9 to 5, da 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 da, and then suddenly you're in a completely different world? Did you notice that visible shift in yourself, or was it always in you? Or
I think it was always in me to a degree. There even earlier than that, before I left Ireland, I had looked at maybe volunteering abroad with a development organization, and so and always, I think, fascinated in other parts of the world. Going back to, I was an avid reader when I was young, and there was always stories and tales from other parts of the world always fascinated me. So I always kind of knew I wanted to experience that. But I think that sort of shift happened gradually. It happened a bit through that combination of time spent living abroad, which was best part of a decade that I was out of Ireland, and then also that combination of sort of study, the academic side, reading, learning about, things like neoliberalism, neoliberal economics, learning about how Latin America in particular was a sort of a laboratory for lots of these economic policies that we're experiencing in this part of the world now. And then also, as I say, that exposure to sort of really interesting people. One of my best friends in Ecuador is a social movement leader, who works on issues of food sovereignty. So, I think that personal experience too of being with people, and I remember having conversations with him deep into the night, of putting different questions to him. Are all corporations bad? Things like this. And I mean, so I was lucky to get that education from people like that, who had the patience to talk me through how it's not about one individual corporation. It's about this whole system that works collectively and internationally to close off options, and then the the output of all of this is, the human rights violations you see, the levels of pollution, and of course the atmospheric emissions as well. So all of those pieces being from my to my mind and through that education part of that same system of distance from and lack of respect for the planet and distance from it and lack of care for other people.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, have you any regrets switching from mainstream to?
No, I wouldn't say I do. I mean, there are times when it's difficult, I suppose, to a degree, and certainly my time in academia, I did my PhD and I did a postdoctoral fellowship, and you know, I have respect for anyone who goes that route, but it's a very precarious and difficult route, and so there were definitely times when I questioned my own sanity for taking all of that on, and trying to stay active at the same time.
Yeah.
I do find that something like academia pushes people into picking a lane.
Yeah.
Ultimately, I picked a lane, and I'm happy that I chose it. But yeah, I mean, there were times, but I never felt. I just I kind of once I got out of being working as a lawyer and so on, I could see immediately that it hadn't been for me, and it wasn't going to be something I would be going back to.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, let's put that down now and come back to your day-to-day role.
Mm,
What does that look like, and which parts of the work in Trócaire are you directly involved
mm.
with?
So I work in Trócaire's policy and advocacy team, and it's a I suppose we call it a global team, even though a lot of our work is you maybe might expect is focused in Ireland. But Trócaire, going back to its foundation in 1973, has its what we call the dual mandate. So not only to work for social justice overseas, but also to work at home in Ireland on raising awareness and changing attitudes and policies here in Ireland as well. And so that's, I suppose, this, the part of the mandate that we work on, although we try always to link the two, and
Yeah.
it's can be challenging at times. Particularly if we're working on looking for the Irish government to do something specific, which we often are. It can seem a bit remote from the troubles of an indigenous movement in Guatemala or oppressed civil society in Zimbabwe or something like that. But we do try as much as we can to link those things. So some the role then, and I'm specifically focused on human rights and civil society space, which is one of our strategic areas. Other colleagues of mine then in the policy team look at different areas of our work and advocate for change on different areas of our work, like climate justice, like sustainable food systems, humanitarian relief, and of course work on the occupied Palestinian territories in Gaza. And um, so we sort of that's the kind of team I'm in. That I can, it's the area of work, but then I interact then with a lot of colleagues both in Ireland and abroad in our different country offices on a regular basis as well. I sort of chair an internal working group which looks at global advocacy around human rights, and we have colleagues from Guatemala and Honduras and other countries where we work attending that on a regular basis, as well as some of our partner organizations come to that as well. And then we also try to work as much as we can in coalition at a European level and at a global level, and in Ireland. So in Ireland, we're a founder member of the Irish Coalition for Business and Human Rights that has about 20 organizations. Save Our Sperrins is an observer organization to that, but we have the Irish Congress of Trade Unions, we have Oxfam Christian Aid, Friends of the Earth, as well as academics in that. And then we work through that at a European level with the European Coalition for Corporate Justice that focuses a lot on EU laws and regulations. And then, we also work more globally with the Treaty Alliance around the binding treaty. So we're sort of that way we're trying ec- to make more of our limited capacity by working together on shared issues. So that's
Yeah.
a lot of the week, but it varies a lot. We have
I'd
sometimes
imagine.
partners come from abroad. Sometimes I get to travel abroad. But that isn't the typical. More typical is probably into Dublin or times into Brussels and Geneva for meetings with politicians and
Uh-huh.
appearances before the parliamentary committees and things like that.
Busy man.
Yeah,
Busy organization. So you just mentioned there in passing, can you tell us exactly what the UN Treaty on Business and Human Rights and how does it build on existing frameworks and why is it needed?
yeah. So I mean, this actually is an initiative and began with Ecuador, where I used to live, along with supported at this stage by South Africa, but it's an initiative of Ecuador. And really, it was set up, I suppose, to address what was and is a huge gap in international law, which is that there are no binding laws on corporate behavior. There are sets of voluntary standards, the most global and most well recognized of which are the UN guiding principles for business human rights. But there are also the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises, and then various different states have their own guidelines and so on like that. And then there are some laws at state level. The UK has Modern Slavery Act, which is primarily a reporting mechanism, but the French has their duty of vigilance law. Germany has a supply chain law, but all of these different laws at national level are varying different degrees of strength. They have different foci, and really there are all these gaps. And into those gaps, then basically because of those gaps, you have essentially corporate impunity, where corporations are either causing directly or contributing indirectly to violations of human rights. We're talking here about, the murders of human rights defenders, over 2,000 of which have been killed, according to Global Witness, since 2012. But we're also talking about lots of other forms of attacks and harassment and intimidation, many of which I know members of Save Our Sperrins have experienced.
Mm.
And then environmental abuses too, pollution, um, dumping, and when these issues are raised, they have there are a lot of facilities for especially transnational corporations to escape any form of responsibility. So the lack of laws, but even when there are laws, there's often complex corporate structures with
Yeah.
various different companies in chains, or outsourcing, different pieces of value chains to different smaller entities. And then there are things like trade and investment agreements that give them specific rights as
Yeah.
corporations, as well as providing them with the ability to sue countries for loss of potential, for actual or potential profits, which is called the Investor State Dispute Settlement System, or ISDS. And all of these things Ecuador had experienced, and that was part of the reason why it became the sponsor to this treaty. Particularly if anyone has heard of the case of Chevron Texaco in the Amazon. It's a famous or infamous case when I was living in Ecuador. Their actual court case that was brought to get environmental remediation for the estimated 18.5 million gallons of toxic chemicals that were dumped into the rainforest there was going on. And even though they got a judgment, there was a judgment in the Ecuadorian court that put a figure of $9.5 billion on it, on Chevron, as it was to environmentally remediate the territory. They had already moved all their assets abroad. And not only that, but they countersued and sued Ecuador under this ISDS system, and won a judgment of nearly 100 million. So all of these, I suppose, reasons are why we need this treaty, and the hope that it would, yeah, plug those gaps, and bring some form of a measure of both prevention, to stop companies from engaging in these activities in the first place, and second of all, some access to justice for the communities, and to remediate the environment. So yeah, those are I guess the what the treaty is trying to achieve.
Yeah, it feels a bit like the Wild West out there, doesn't it? They can just do as they wish with
Yes. Yeah,
impunity.
yeah. Yeah,
Um,
and I mean, one thing that I think has come clear to me over my time living in Ecuador and back here, I remember it striking me about 15 years when I was still living there, was that the extent to which many of these same practices and power relations and policies that have been sort of long implemented in places like Ecuador are increasingly being brought back to under world systems theory. I suppose you talk about the core countries, and we've seen it, for example, with the Energy Charter Treaty, which is a highly problematic international agreement that contains this ISDS function. And so when Germany tried to phase out coal plants several years ago, they were sued by a transnational energy company under that same mechanism to try to prevent them from abandoning coal. So yeah, and many of these same things are now, yes, there's a wild west abroad. Uh,
yeah.
Often at the behest of these companies, but it's increasingly coming to our shores as well.
One wonders, these companies all are people by human beings,
Mm,
and human beings have children, and
mm.
I wonder where their children will live in the future. But, um,
I think it's a very good point. I think that ability to that ability to sort of compartmentalize and separate our lives, and particularly, I suppose, when we live under, you know, when we live under a global economic system, which is what we have, I would call it neoliberalism. Some don't like that term, but um, whatever you would say about it, there is a clear global economic system, and it is one that, reduces things to a price. It puts a price on everything.
yeah,
And I suppose maybe there's a rationale that with this money earned, we will buy ourselves out of and our children out of these issues. We can see with the richest of richest men, mostly men, that they're going steps further and creating dystopian underground bunkers and buying up parts of New Zealand because they think they'll, ride out the coming climate apocalypse there or something like that, rather than committing themselves to solidarity, to action, to reducing emissions in the here and now, but we don't have to be like them, I think. But what worries me, I suppose, is the extent to which in Ireland, in sort of common sense, if you want to use that term, parlance, effectively advancing the interests of transnational corporations is taken as an almost unquestioned good
yeah,
because it's seen as bringing jobs and wealth. Even though there are still lots and lots of issues, I would say, even with that, even if you take that at face value, including that many of the people who work in this system are frankly miserable. I have been one, so I know. But also that ultimately, this system is built on sand. The foundations are completely weak and cannot hold.
yeah. I have many friends who are professionals, doctors, lawyers, whatever, and occasionally I meet them over the years. I might have been in college with them or in school with them or something like that, and I know they're intelligent people. And I just cannot get over how blinkered the thinking is around it.
Right.
One, not wanting to engage with the whole issue in the first place. As they jet off. Well, these days they were going away on their private cruises or whatever. And there's just no engagement with it. And
Yeah.
I thought, you're intelligence people. You've got grandchildren, and many. And I just wonder. Or they play
Yeah.
golf,
Yeah.
but golf's a great game. I've no objection against it, But they could be putting their talents to great use at this period
Yeah.
in their lives, and that's what makes me sad. But how did we land out like this as human beings,
Yeah.
uncaring about those around us?
Yeah.
However.
I know. I mean, I would say uh, I think that there's a there's a the logic that underpins neoliberalism that reduces everything to a number, and that also has a very dim view of humanity that basically says all humans are out to advance themselves, and if it isn't you, it will be your neighbor or it will be someone else. I think that logic makes people feel like I think it puts a sort of an intellectual straitjacket on people, and it's very, very hard then to imagine doing anything else except for what you occasionally see. I mean, a different version of what the billionaires are doing, but people who give it up and go live in a commune or live in the woods or something like that. But again, you'll still be breathing the same
Mm-hmm.
air, and
Drinking the
we
same
saw
water.
that community in the US that was hit by forest fires a couple of years ago had been one of people like that who had left cities and had deliberately chosen that community. I can't think of the name right now, but they had chosen it because they felt that it was unlikely to be experience the worst impacts of climate change. So again, there they were intelligent people who
Yeah.
knew the climate change was real, but their more sort of individualistic approach ended up completely backfiring on them. So it goes to show that inoculating ourselves against this is not really a possibility. But I think people don't see a route out, and I think that's part of the problem that we have. Is having some form of vision for a better life that people can get behind.
Okay. Um, so coming back once more to Trócaire, so how do you engage with or business or policymakers and communities
Mm,
around the UN Treaty and business and human rights,
yeah.
locally or abroad?
So I mean, in terms of this, I mean, we work, I suppose, with we work directly and indirectly, as I've already sort of talked about, in terms of, say, outreach to policymakers. So, here in Ireland and also in Northern Ireland, because Trócaire is also present there,
Yeah.
we work directly. We have direct contact with politicians. I would say, as an aside, in the South and in the Republic in this current time, present government, with one or two exceptions, is, I would say, the most difficult to reach that we've had, and the doors are not open, and nor are they necessarily being slammed shut, but they were just being ignored, which is deeply concerning because we've seen, one of the areas that I work along with this business human rights is also civil society space, or
Hmm.
specifically closing civil society space, and we can see this again manifesting in different parts of the world in different ways. But overall, what we can see is a generalized disregard for civil society as a sort of, sometimes it goes far beyond that into an outright demonization of civil society. We're getting the softer end of that in Ireland, but it's definitely a change from a time when civil society was considered to be an essential component of a functioning democracy, which I believe it is, to now being considered a somewhat of an add-on, which is concerning. But that's, I suppose, how we work with policymakers, and then we have allies in Brussels and in other places to work more at the EU level, and also and we're a member of the Corporate Justice Coalition, which is UK-wide network of organisations. And then with our communities, I suppose we work sort of through, so we have country offices. I have colleagues in some of the different countries, that I've mentioned,
Yeah.
where we focus more on human rights work. So depending on the country context, our
Yeah.
focus can change. And we then work with partner organizations, and they in turn with communities. So I suppose that's the relationship there. But then sometimes, like when partners like the Shinka Parliament and others come to Ireland, I'm working much more closely with them, brokering meetings and trying to create opportunities to bring their voices, their experiences, and their expertise to the policymakers and trying to influence them through those means. we don't work with businesses at Trócaire.
Okay.
Some within the Irish Coalition on Business Human Rights do. There be they more civil society or more academic side. My view on it, and it's a question I'm often presented with, is what about the good companies? And my response, I suppose, is that I feel, like I've said already, this is a systemic issue, and systemic global issues need systemic global responses. So choosing a company A and saying you're a good company is fine on some level, but I feel that ultimately, when the profit motive is the number one priority, then it's very, very difficult to see a systemic approach. If, say, company A decides that actually, rather than, you know, having more green, sustainable practices, we actually think, and our shareholders are demanding that we make more profit by being less sustainable, by cutting corners on environmental standards, by cutting corners on labor standards, by seeking ways to pay less tax, et cetera, et cetera,
Yeah.
then ultimately that's probably what they're going to do. So,
Yeah.
so there are, yeah, there. To me, I think the system and the incentives within the system need to be changed at a much higher level.
Couldn't agree more. It's working with companies where the profit is always ahead. To me, it always felt like sticking a band-aid, on the problem. Okay, yeah, we've crossed all our I's or we've crossed our T's and dotted our I's, but they will
Yeah.
follow the mighty dollar, and it's
And
just
this is the problem too, is we can see that it changes with political context. I mean, not every company does this, but for example, a few years ago, when I think climate change was being taken seriously by political leaders, going back about 10 years, around the time of the Paris Agreement,
yeah,
we had lots of companies establishing sustainability departments, making firm commitments, but again, not legally binding commitments. Um, and now, particularly since Trump has come in for the second time, we see, move away, companies pulling out of coalitions, abandoning former um, commitments, changing their websites to no longer say what they used to say, closing
yeah.
their sustainability departments. So again, it just goes to show that something that's built on voluntary commitments is not a sustainable system.
Okay. Um, some argue that stronger human rights rules might put off investors or slow economic growth. How
Yeah.
would you respond to this?
I don't think there's a I suppose let me take a step back. I'd say that the first thing is that we would always argue for, and I'm not sure how many people would ultimately disagree with this at an individual level, the primacy of human rights over trade and investment. So, um, people have a right to life, people have a right to health, people have a right not to be polluted, threatened, intimidated, killed for often what is the actually standing up for things like clean air, clean water, land, trees, uh, the very essence of life itself on the planet. And yet we know that they often are. And primacy of human rights over trade and investment then would and should completely undermine this ISDS system that I've already mentioned.
Yeah,
But instead, we live in a system where uh, human rights, while broadly, recognized and well, maybe not as broadly as before, but still, accepted in at its word. Doesn't really have a huge amount of teeth in terms of legal enforceability, whereas something like ISDS does, and those don't even happen in public law courts. They happen in secretive arbitration rooms, with often arbitrated over by people with long experience working for multinational corporations. So, but those judgments are often far more enforceable than human rights judgments. So we don't have a system where human rights is has that primacy, but it should have. And
hmm
and that's an essential part. The other part is that it is really, I suppose, sort of, I would feel like a false dichotomy or false division that's often created between protecting rights in the environment on the one hand and jobs and wealth on the other hand. There isn't really any evidence over many years to show that there is any great correlation between dropping standards. If that were the case, then the global south should be the wealthy part of the world because
Yeah.
for sure that's where standards have been, you know, routinely reduced and gutted since, particularly since the 1990s, and that isn't clearly the case, and the
Yeah.
EU should be impoverished because it has the the lowest the highest standards of many regions, and so then I mean, I suppose the other thing to always bear in mind, though, I think is what Naomi Klein described as the shock doctrine. What we see is when there are crises, be they real crises or somewhat manufactured crises, there is always a push, and it's always in the same direction. It is more deregulation, it is more privatization, it is more corporate power, and that's what we see with Trump at the EU level. Where we see now, for all that what I just said about the EU is actually experiencing its biggest push to deregulate in its history. And Ukraine and Putin to some extent, and Trump in particular, is being used as the shock that they are using. And it's at all levels of the EU. So the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive that I work on was a law that the EU brought in just last year which would force the biggest companies, very biggest companies in the EU, based in the EU, including, for example, US multinationals, if they were based in the EU or had
Hmm.
significant enough operations, uh, to um, to look at their value chains with a view to where would risks of human rights violations and environmental damage occur, and then to take what were called sort of acceptable measures, reasonable measures to address those, and also then created the possibility of a civil liability system that would allow for communities and individuals who are the victims of those sorts of abuses, if they occur, to get some measure of justice by suing
Hmm.
those companies in the courts in the EU under EU law. And so this has been the subject of probably some of the most intense lobbying the EU has
Hmm.
ever experienced, led, according to research from SOMO in the Netherlands, by ExxonMobil, the same
All right. Of
ExxonMobil
course.
that knew of the existence of climate change going back to the start of the 1970s and spent millions covering it up
Yeah.
and misinforming. And so, this is the other reality of all of this. So we're set up with a kind of a false choice, and what's never on the table, I think, is some form of more is something that doesn't put profit first.
Yeah.
Some other forms of systems, as have many cultures down through the centuries and millennia of human existence, have not set themselves up along these lines. I don't think this is an inevitability that we have to organize our societies and our world along these lines. But this is what we're told always.
Yeah. Yeah. It's the narrative, and we no longer control the narrative, which is
Yeah.
unfortunate. But putting people's health and well-being at the core of everything,
Yes.
and
And the planet, and the planet.
yeah,
I mean,
sorry, and the
yeah.
planet, of course.
And
Yeah.
that's
Well,
when
you can't have health and well-being
Yeah,
without the
yeah,
planet. Uh,
absolutely, yeah. But I
so
mean, we were in Geneva recently with our Guatemalan partners. Margarita Domingo Diaz, who's a Mayan indigenous leader, just at every opportunity, repeated, including speaking in at the UN, said, we are by damaging the planet, we are damaging ourselves.
yeah,
It's a simple root fact that if you take away all of the GDP growth and other, if you were to start from there as your starting point,
yeah,
um, but where we tend to start from is what we see, what we perceive as the reality that we have a global economic system, um, but all of this works on. on the basis of division. And this is the problem with how, how we ended up where we are, is that corporate power more broadly works on division. For the 1990s and early 2000s, I would say that division was largely global north, global south.
Hmm.
We reaped many of the benefits, and that partly explains, I think, why neoliberalism still has so much legitimacy here, because
Yeah.
it's in relatively recent memory. We can remember
Yeah.
a time when it seemed to bring a lot of prosperity, but that prosperity was coming even then at the cost of lives and ecosystems in the global south. But since then, we've moved into a different phase where now we're seeing the competition much more, say, dividing between states. So if Ireland doesn't have a really low tax regime, some other country will, and will come and eat our lunch. And then we also see increasingly divisions between urban and rural populations being set up as the big problem. Why won't these, tree hugging rural people let us have mines so that we can buy more cars and iPhones?
Mm.
And then, in places like Guatemala, the divisions between indigenous and non-indigenous, but ultimately these are all false divisions because we're all human beings. We all need clean air, clean water, these things to survive on the planet, an atmosphere that doesn't, burn us. And so if that again was the starting point, rather than starting from where we are, as the old expression in Ireland goes, if that someone asks you for directions, you say, "Well, if I were you, I wouldn't start from here." I wouldn't start from here.
If the treaty does become binding, how do you think it would be enforced here in Ireland or in and the UK?
Hmm.
Um, so it really protects people instead of sort of sitting on a shelf. Right, we've done that
Yeah.
and just we've stored
Yeah.
there, as
I
we've
mean,
seen.
this is where, yeah, you really get into the nitty-gritty of the treaty. And so I've been on an education learning process myself, about the different aspects of the treaty, because it's one thing to think of it in general terms as a good thing. But then it comes down to what is actually in there. What does it oblige states and, ideally companies, although at the moment that's not really on the table to put any actual obligations on companies, even though, as I've already said, companies enjoy rights. So you would think anyone that enjoys rights should also bear some duties. But I mean, what it envisages, in kind of broad terms, is that there would be, three forms of liability to hold companies to account. There would be administrative liability, which would essentially mean the state or some state agency would have the power to, well, ideally, investigate complaints. That would require them to be able to access information, and then levy fines when there are breaches. Uh, Also, criminal liability. This is still very much a bone of contention, whether criminal liability only refers to, say, particular corporate individual actors, um, uh, and that would probably be in very rare cases then that there is one person who can be identified as having somehow gone rogue, or as exists in the jurisprudence of several states, which would be actually to hold companies themselves criminally liable. And then the final one, which is probably the most important one, is civil liability. So that ability to bring cases. But here there's a huge amount of work that needs to be done, because it's one thing to have the right, but it's another thing to overcome all the huge barriers that exist. So the
Ah,
financial barriers,
yeah,
legal aid, the information barriers that I've already mentioned, linguistic barriers.
yeah,
Then there are procedural barriers, things like the doctrine of forum nonconvenience that allows companies to say, as happened in the Ecuador case, the Chevron case that I mentioned, where they tried initially to sue the American US multinational in a US court, and it got kicked out. And they said, no, no, the US isn't the best place to bring this case. The best place is in Ecuador. Of course, when they won the case in Ecuador, there were no assets belonging to the company in Ecuador. So that's another barrier. And so, yeah, so all of those barriers need to be overcome.
yeah.
The treaty does have text that would try to address these, but I mean, I don't think anyone that is arguing for the treaty thinks that it is a one, you know, one thing that is going to solve all our problems, but
Yeah.
it would be a significant step in the right direction. And then, one of the important things would be that it would provide for those affected communities to sue that company in the courts in the state where it has its main base. And that's, I think, crucial to getting justice.
Yeah. That's very interesting. Um, so for our listeners, what could they take away from this conversation? Particularly people like us, a campaign group. Where do you think we should focus our energy or hope um, going
Yeah,
forward?
it's tricky. I mean, like I mentioned earlier, the Conga mine case, and I also mentioned the Shinka Parliament, and I see some similarities in those, which were two long running, um, protracted, but I suppose you could say, depending on your definition, but successful on some level examples of resistance against a mine. One in the case of Congo, where the mine never went ahead, and the second in the case of the Shinka Parliament, where the mine was started to operate but has been suspended and hasn't operated since. I think in both those cases, those activists on the ground would say the number one was local mobilization. That was really the key. That was the foundation stone
Yeah,
of everything. But I also think they would say that that wasn't enough of itself, and
yeah,
that other aspects were required, particularly sort of technical know-how, be that scientific studies, be that legal challenges. I think that not only works to diversify the approach, but also to legitimize the struggle often in the minds of, let's be honest, middle classes. If they see,
yeah,
particularly talking, say, about indigenous people in Latin America, but it could be said of some rural populations too, even here, that, when they see people out protesting, they might be inclined to buy into the mainstream media and a notion that these are, just sort of crazy people
yeah,
who don't like progress.
yeah,
But then when they see, academics, scientists, lawyers, so on, speaking up for them, I think they feel that maybe that's not the case, and maybe there's something more going on here that they need to look at. So I think it has a dual function of actually providing evidence and means to do lobbying and legal challenges, but also I
uh-huh,
think it legitimizes and broadens the base. And I do think then ultimately, from what I said earlier about these global systemic issues need global systemic responses. I think, trying to link into to these wider networks, trying to share lessons. I mean, I get frustrated, very frustrated, at the moment with the EU with all this deregulatory push, because I lived in Latin America, I studied Latin America for years. Like the impacts of deregulation, is perfectly clear there. There's so much evidence. It did
yeah,
not bring wealth. Yes, it brought wealth to a very select, small cohort of people.
yeah,
And what it did otherwise was bring environmental destruction. It brought deaths and violence. It brought displacement and migration. And it brought ultimately also contributed to the climate crisis. And so,
yeah,
deregulation, it makes the it benefits the powerful at the expense of the most marginalized, and it always has, and it always will, and so these, drawing these lessons, I think, from other places. There are communities in Latin America, but at times it's frustrating that even communities within Latin America, when I've spoken to Guatemalan partners and Honduran partners, sometimes they're not aware of what's happened in Peru or Bolivia, So even with
yeah,
internet and so on, the information doesn't always move as quickly as we might think. But I think
yeah,
it's really important that those global links and to come, I mean, I've been very pleased that our Guatemalan partners, when they came last year to attend the 10th session of the negotiations for a treaty, they really saw the benefit. I wasn't sure that they would. I thought maybe they would think this is just This is just
Talking.
a high level talking shop.
Yeah,
And meantime, we're down on the ground. We're facing these very real issues, very real threats. How is this helping us? But actually, what they said was, this is what we need because the Guatemalan state doesn't have the capacity. It isn't strong enough to stand up against big corporations.
yeah,
And that's the
yeah,
case of so many countries in the global south on their own, individually. Like I said, the tactic is divide and conquer. On their own, individually, they don't have the ability to stand up. And
yeah,
this is the problem. They get picked off one by one. Whereas if countries can really come together to put something like this in place, a global framework, a global set of standards that are enforceable, um, that would be a game changer. And so for communities and social movements to bring their voices to that. And I was in Geneva a couple of weeks ago. There were a lot of global South voices. They were from Africa, from Latin America in particular, some from Asia. It was powerful. They made powerful interventions, including one of the people who was there was one of the lawyers in that Chevron case that I
okay.
mentioned in Ecuador. So it links it links all the way back.
Yeah, yeah. Follow the money trail.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. We've discovered that ourselves over the years that building solidarity with other anti-mining groups from all around the world, and we just feel it's growing, a growing movement, and
Yeah.
becoming stronger and more informed, and we're able to give, talk to people, and they say, well, they learn from us, but we also learn from them,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
it's proved very, very powerful. And then we discover actually the same few people are behind a lot of some of the problems, and same few companies and corporations.
Yes.
And,
Yeah.
yeah, so
Yeah.
interesting times we live in.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think there's a real need. And, I was at an event yesterday with a number of like-minded people and people were discussing and maybe clinging to straws a little bit, clutching at straws. But there was talk about, the recent presidential election here
Oh
in the
yeah,
Republic
yeah,
and the campaign that Catherine Connolly put together, um, and that call for a new republic, and that framing and that unity, and that energy. I think there, and maybe something similar happening in with the mayoral election in New York. And
yeah,
so, of course, we're not to overlook the fact that forces arranged against them are incredibly powerful
yeah,
and incredibly organized
yeah,
and have been in a lot of ways, the what we see in the world we live in is the result of planning that goes back a long time
yeah,
by private interests. I think the book The Globalists, by the historian Quinn Slobodian, talks about this particular group of Austrian economists that were appalled at the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, were appalled at this terrible thing called democracy, and the attacks. What they saw as the attacks on private property, and set out to create basically a political project that would use economics as its tool to reshape the world. And they succeeded.
yeah,
But to reduce this whole global issue and this common sense down to actually a political project started by a bunch of extremely reactionary Austrian economists, I think gives us demystifies it a little bit. It doesn't necessarily make it less of a challenge, but at least we can say we don't, we know what it is we're up against.
yeah, yeah. And just because it's always been this way doesn't mean it has to always go forward being this way.
Yeah,
Change can
absolutely.
happen very quickly.
It can indeed, and it does, and it will. It
Yeah.
will. I mean, the only
Well, there's
question
no
is,
choice. It has to change.
yeah, but the question I suppose is just, will it change for the worse, or can we change it for the better? That's really we're at a strange moment though when every election is, in this part of the world, is a change election now.
Yeah.
When I lived in Latin America, going back, over 20 years ago, uh, every election was always a change election, because
Yeah.
of the dynamics that we live in. Whereas in this part of the world for a long time, they were much more about continuity, because as I say, we were in that period, we were enjoying the fruits of this system. Now
Yeah.
we're not, and so now every election is a change election. But
Yeah.
what we get in these elections is the choice of status quo or something worse, in my view. And so, what rarely gets onto the electoral uh, panel, I suppose you could say, is the possibility of some sort of positive change.
Yeah.
And when it does, in the likes of Catherine Connolly, it does well.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, we can just all we can do is hope and keep doing what we're doing in the world, I guess.
Absolutely, yeah.
Chris, so at the end of this conversation, every podcast, I always ask people two questions, the same, which are, um, could you recommend someone whose voice would add a listening to this podcast and deepen the conversation going forward?
I could think of many, and probably given my bias toward Latin America, they would mainly be Latin American voices. I
Yeah,
suppose
fine.
the question would be if you would have the ability to have interpretation or so on, but
Yeah, that's a problem. I
yeah,
probably wouldn't have interpretation. It's
yeah,
just because it's just me doing it at the minute.
yeah, I
I
know.
suddenly become an overnight hit worldwide or something,
Yes.
and I
I mean,
can't see that happening.
I mentioned Gustavo Castro. I still have a little bit of contact with him, not that much, but um, he came to Ireland when I was coordinator of LASK, and at the conference we asked him to speak about trade agreements and land, and he just gave such a wonderful, simple, straightforward, no nonsense, no jargon explanation of the difference between trade and trade agreements and how harmful trade agreements are, because trade agreements aren't about trade. Essentially, they're vehicles for all of these. We're locking in all of these policies at a global level that we've been talking about. So he's someone, and then another would be a friend and someone I've
Sorry, before you go,
yeah.
is Gustavo is does he speak English? He
We
would
spoke
need an
Spanish when he
interpreter,
was
would he?
here. I'm not sure. He might have some. Um,
Right.
One
Uh,
person that I know has some is a personal friend and someone who I published with. We wrote a piece on environmental colonialism and neocolonialism in Latin America for a Routledge publication. Her name
right.
is Rocio Silva Santisteban, and
Okay.
she is something that is increasingly rare in this world, which is, I would say, she is like a polymath. She is a published author, poet, academic, anti-mining activist, feminist, Marxist,
Right.
and human rights defender, and was nearly president of Peru a few years ago,
Right.
and so yeah, I would say she's someone that is always worth speaking to in my experience.
Okay. And perhaps you'd send me on their details after
Yeah,
this. That'd be
yeah,
really great. It will be in the future. I'm spreading my net
yes.
wider these days.
Okay.
And then the last thing, finally,
Mm,
what keeps you going? What
yeah.
gives you hope?
I mean, I really feel that I mean it's funny, but one of the things that gives me hope is the sheer power of corporate power, because I feel like it's the battle of battles. I feel like it's the heart of this these issues. It's the one ring to bind them all, to use the Lord of the Rings terminology. I really think that is it. You know, you look at some of the figures that come out about climate change, that like five companies are responsible for 12.5% of all emissions since 1854, or I think it might have been just 36 companies responsible for half of the emissions since in 2023, if I'm not mistaken, on the year. So, like, actually, this whole edifice sits on a relatively narrow base, and even though they're unbelievably powerful, um, it is a narrow base, and I do think that they're far more vulnerable than we think they are. And we look at the level uh, of lobbying that a company like Exxon is prepared to go to kill what was ultimately a relatively mild measure by the EU shows, I think, how fearful they are, and I think that they know, particularly the fossil fuel companies, they know that they're ultimately doomed, but the problem is they're trying to bring us all down with them, and so funny enough, I feel it makes me feel good, even though it's depressing at times. I feel like I'm not wasting time. I'm fighting the most important fight. I'm doing so at a very tangential level now, not to say that, not to make myself
Yes.
out to be some great warrior.
Yeah.
I'm
No.
sitting in nice, comfortable Blackrock County Louth, but at least the work I do, I feel is really important. And then the other thing that gives me inspiration again is those social movements in Latin America, and the academic who's based in Maynooth, Lawrence Cox, who studies social movements. I was reading something he wrote not that long ago, and he said, you know, the key is to look at what the social movements are doing, what they're doing well, and to follow that. And I find that inspirational. I find those people inspirational. It was a lot of work for me the last few weeks when we had partners from Guatemala, but it's the kind of work that I would do again in a heartbeat, because to stand alongside them when they speak, to listen to them, their wisdom and their passion. That's really inspirational. And I think I wrote a social media post afterwards when Margarita that I mentioned spoke, saying, "Here is someone who is standing up for the planet, standing up for her community, who's protecting the environment, who's protecting future generations, in any sane system, she would be held up as a hero, as an absolute example of
Hmm.
the best of humanity. Instead, she is denigrated. She is, threatened, and so this is the system that we live in, but it's completely upside down, and
Yeah.
so people like that give me inspiration.
Chris, thank you very much for coming onto the podcast today. Thank you very much for your burning passion and care, obvious care for humanity. And I really hope that we can get this treaty through in the UN, and we'll reap, our children or grandchildren around the world, particularly in the global south, will reap the benefits of that going forward. And it's all of us. It's the people on the ground, but it's also the people, the thinkers, the writers. It takes us all, and it's a wonderful worldwide movement. And thank you.
Thanks very much, Marilla. And I should have said, those all of you would say we're parents are part of the inspiration too.
What a conversation. I think many of us listening will have felt the range and breadth of Chris's knowledge, from the global push for a UN treaty on business and human rights, right down to the realities faced by communities on the ground. He's helped us see how deregulation so often serves power, and how harmful trade agreements can quietly shape the world in favour of those who already have too much control. And yet, through it all, Chris has reminded us that this isn't inevitable. The sheer power of corporations that he spoke of, the influence they wield over governments, over policy, over our natural world, is being challenged by people everywhere. From social movements rising in the global south to the change elections now taking place across continents, we're seeing a shift. Ordinary people reclaiming their voice, insisting that business must serve life, not destroy it. For those of us here in the Sperrins, this conversation matters deeply. It connects our local struggle to a much wider one, a global call for accountability, justice, and human rights. Chris, thank you for your insight and your integrity. And to our listeners, thank you for joining us once again on Protecting the Sperrins. Until next time, keep listening, keep questioning, and keep standing for the places you love. You've been listening to the Save Our Sperrins podcast, Voices from the Frontline. Thank you for joining us today. All the links you'll need, from campaign updates to our social media pages, as well as links shared by today's guests and resources mentioned in the conversation, are available in the show notes. please take a moment to share this podcast with friends, neighbours, or anyone who cares about protecting our land and communities. And don't forget to hit the follow button on your podcast platform. It really helps the algorithm spread these voices further. Together, our voices are stronger. Thanks for listening. And until next time, keep standing with the land, the water, the air, and the people who protect them.